Okay, I think we will get started. So if last people coming in could take their seats, that would be greatly appreciated. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming this evening. My name is Ruvi Ziegler. I'm chair of the Oxford European Association, which is one of the organizations that is put together this event alongside Oxford for Europe and the European Movement Oxford branch. I've looked at the calendar because people like various anniversaries, happy or not, and realized this is exactly to the date 15 months since we had in the adjacent room a panel just 3 days before the second reading of the EU notification of withdrawal bill in the House of Commons. We had a panel on what could we expect of Brexit, and all sorts of issues that were discussed then, if one goes through the tweets and the Facebook blogs, etc., around the customs union, the Irish border, the impact on trade, the impact on citizens' rights. Rather than prophesizing, we were just discussing what is still very much our current reality, and it's in a way a slightly depressing anniversary. But what we are aiming to do today is slightly different. That one was a politicians panel because it was with a view to that upcoming vote in the House of Commons. Today, we've got an experts panel. We still believe in them. And what we want to do is look at a certain set of issues which we think are particularly relevant to discussing the impacts of Brexit. This is why for this event, for those of you who are on Twitter, we're using the hashtag Brexit Impact in one word. And we'll be looking at the impact of Brexit in the Oxfordshire region on science and universities, on health, on business and on citizens' rights, before we later on turn to look at what's next, to look at the sort of initiatives that exist today, potentially to stop Brexit. What I'll start by saying is that this event isn't cost-free. And this is a volunteer organization, but it still had to fork the relevant money to hire this venue and the equipment, etc. So please be very generous when you leave the halls or buckets where you can show not just your appreciation for this event, but your hopeful desire for more events to come and more activities in the coming weeks and months to go as we proceed with the campaign. So the running order for this evening is as follows. We'll be looking, as I said, through those 4 areas in turn, and I'll present our speakers in a minute. In each of these segments, each of the speakers will give an opening spiel, as it were, of 5 minutes or so. Then, if need be, I'll ask some sort of a follow-up question, and then Karen will very kindly use her roving mic to try and get to you. And what we want here, and I realize this is a bit of a dangerous statement to make in a panel, but we don't necessarily need to have a question mark at the end of your comment. What we are actually happy, in fact, we are desiring, is to have short testimonials in each of these areas from people in this audience who, like the panelists will explore, have been impacted in those respected areas or perceive an impact about to happen. Of course, if you do have a question to the relevant panelists, they'll, I'm sure, be very happy to answer them. And then, as I said at the very end, we'll get to the what next stage. So our speakers for that lion's share of the event, for the first part, are in the order in which they'll speak. Dr. Mike Galsworthy, who is a program director at Scientists for EU. Is that right to say that it was established when the idea of a referendum was first announced in 2015? Possibly. well, close enough. And he's...
May 8th, when David Cameron came to power, with the promise of a referendum in the pocket. So May 8th, 2015.
Right. So
coming up to our birthday. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Another anniversary in the going. And he's really one of the leading voices in the movement to stop Brexit. I'm sure he'll have much to say at the very end as well when we get to discuss the next steps. We'll then kind of move to discuss health. And Nick Fahy is a researcher and consultant in health policy and systems at the Nuffield Department of Primary Care Health Sciences at the University of Oxford. He's also at Green Templeton College, I believe. We'll then hear from Antony David about business. Antony's Chief Executive of Solid State Logic, which is based in Begbroke Science Park here in Oxford. And then last but not least, we'll hear from the very local member of the European Parliament, Catherine Bearder, is a Liberal Democrat politician, elected representative for the southeast of England in the European Parliament, and very relevant to the discussion of citizens' rights as she sits on the Brexit Steering Committee of the European Parliament. Oh, well, here's Frank, yes. So let me turn to Mike first, and perhaps you can give us some sort of an overview of the impact that you identify on science and universities of the Brexit process.
Alrighty, hi everyone. The University of Oxford, the large infrastructure, science infrastructures that you have in Oxford, and the small innovative businesses here in Oxford are absolutely vital to Oxford's economy. The university itself is a huge employer, and with small innovative businesses, we know that small innovative businesses are 2/3 of the employment in this country, and they drive growth and high quality jobs growth. And coming off the back of a recession, it's always those small businesses that drive it. And if you're looking at the university and small businesses, these are not two separate areas, they are interwoven. So last year in November, Oxford announced its 150th spin-out company. It has been spinning out companies since 1959, including Oxford Nanopore, a DNA sequencing company which is now worth a cool $1 billion. And that spin-out process has been ramping up very quickly over the last few years. But it's not just the small innovative businesses that are produced from Oxford University, it is also those that start up themselves around Oxford increasingly rely on the collaborations with the universities, networking with the universities, the administrative help of the universities. And this is where EU funding starts to come in, because for years we have known that this pairing between businesses and universities has been vital to driving economies, but the Horizon 2020 programme has been excellent at providing juice to do that. So it actually started in 2014 demanding of universities, you don't get any money unless you're actually working with these small businesses. And how does Oxford University do with that funding? Well, it comes top. Ahead of Cambridge and ahead of UCL, it's had nearly €250 million since Horizon 2020 started in 2014. So Oxford cares about science. I know, I've been here since the referendum debate started 7 or 8 times now, twice at Diamond Light Source, twice at Hertford College. There was another time recently about EU citizens' rights. Here's another, I can think of more. But Oxford cares deeply about its science. And so does the science community at large care deeply about Europe and our relationship with Europe. During the referendum campaign, nearly all scientists were against leaving our matrix, our framework, our community, our ecosystem of the EU. We had Stephen Hawking and 150 fellows of the Royal Society write a letter about it. We had the science ministers from the last 25 years all line up together to say we should remain. We gathered 5,500 names at Scientists for EU in a petition. There were 13 Nobel Prize winners that were for Remain, and all of the vice-chancellors of the universities across the UK. Over 100 of them put their names to remaining, not a single one in Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales or England was for leaving. So, the strength of feeling between Oxford and science and the EU, and Oxford and the EU is all bound together. So it's no surprise that after Brexit, it caused a lot of concern immediately. 1 week after the vote, we started at Scientists for EU collecting stories of what the damage was. We had we had 400 submissions, lots talking about xenophobia and uncertainty going forward, but there was already a hard impact of jobs turned down, people actually leaving, funding and hiring freezes, and diminished roles on EU projects. This trend has continued since. At the time, UCAS dropped EU students coming here by about 7%. Since the vote, our participation on EU science programs has dropped from 15% to 12%. Numbers of people leaving our universities has increased 19%, as well as us losing the European Medicines Agency. A Galileo lab has gone. Galileo contracts, that's the GPS system of Europe, are now under threat. And 1 year from now, we are going to drag and drop 3.5 million citizens, EU citizens, from guaranteed rights into a settled status. And given Windrush, how do you think that's going to come out? So all of these frameworks, from Euratom, European Medicines Agency, European Investment Bank, Customs Union, and the single VAT system, are all things that our government has not adequately prepared for. Our science programme is covered until 2020, but afterwards it looks to be in jeopardy. Our government has been kicking cans down the road, but at some point it's going to meet a mountain of cans that it can kick no more. And the politicians at that stage, we posit, will need a route out. And that's why we are advocating a people's vote on whatever Theresa May can bring back, so that we can evaluate again what Brexit really means. Now, I'm a scientist, so I think it's fine to experiment. But if experiments are going wrong and people are getting hurt by it, like in clinical trials, then it is only ethical to stop it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So we'll return, of course, to the issue of a referendum on the deal or people's vote in the final section. Can I ask you a couple of follow-up questions to the situation as we stand in universities and the prospects, and they're going to be a slightly kind of devilish advocate type questions, because I'm sure other people come across them. I mean, one question relates to the ability to be outside not just the European Union, but also outside the customs union and the single market, and still be a member of programs such as Horizon 2020. To what extent do you think there will be a problem for the United Kingdom if he wishes to and is willing to contribute to that program, to continue to be a member of that program, even if it decides to leave those other institutions as well?
Right, well, the Science Commissioner, Carlos Moedas, has already said that the UK cannot be a full associated member in future because of our size and because of what our red lines are. Then it means that we are going to have a bespoke deal, but not a bespoke deal in the way we'd like, a bespoke deal in the way that the rest of Europe gets advantage from us, but also contains us. Here are the key elements of that, and that is, if we are willing to pay our way and more to help out the rest of the system, then we are more likely to get more parts of that program. If we are prepared to engage in free movement, not just for scientists and their families, but sort of wider and embrace the spirit of it, that would then get us more depth of involvement in the program. They do want us in the program to a degree because our expertise is good, but there are parts of the program coming up, such as investment in innovative businesses and small innovative businesses, and that's a competitive area. And there's very little incentive for the EU27, who see the opportunity to get ahead, to have us included in actually stimulating competitive business growth. So they're going to tailor something for us that gets the best collaboration of our scientists, but keeps some of the best bits in terms of, you know, marketing scientific developments largely within the remaining EU.
Right. Oh, that's very good. Thank you. So another kind of troubling question may relate to that drop in numbers of people who may want to come here from the EU27. And again, some people might try to argue, well, we are clearly now in a period of uncertainty. People don't know what the scope, and the government is at fault for that, but that will get itself sorted, and the UK still has top universities, and it still attracts people from not just outside the EU, but indeed outside the Commonwealth. It attracts Americans, attracts Chinese. So why would that be not something that UK universities will be able to continue to do, again, even if freedom of movement ends?
Okay, two factors here. One is the reputation of the country as a whole and the brand of the country as a whole, as a community. And that brand took a hit on the night of the Brexit referendum. As someone said to a BBC journalist that was in their article, the UK went from being cool to uncool very quickly. That was a scientist in one of the labs. And so even though our science community is more than welcoming, because there are no foreigners in science, we're all an international community wherever you go, nevertheless, the tone of the country as a whole can put people off. Scientists in the lab that then go out about town wearing different clothes and speaking with accents oftentimes feel nervous given the current climate. So that makes it harder. You know, the branding of the country is very important, as well as the branding of the university, especially if you want people to come here and bring up small children and that kind of stuff. They think very carefully about where they want to bring up their children. The other thing is, very quickly, in a competitive world, it's always a game of fine margins. So if Oxford University is in a race with other universities across the world in order to get the best talent, because once you've got the best talent, then you attract more best talent. If you have a few years out of the game and you get behind the person you're racing with, even if you're running at the same speed, you're behind, and you have to have more to catch up. And if they're ahead, then they'll be drawing in the talent that then attracts more talent. That's the kind of dynamic that we're looking at. So we suffer for having a few years off the boil.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I now want to invite people's contributions. And as I said, they could be people who have experience at a university or science, or questions that you might have for Mike. Anyone? I see a hand down there. Yeah. And then there's one there.
Yes, I'd like to make a sort of comment on the impact in the science area. So I work in the nuclear industry, and we have, I have £36 million worth of contracts dependent on EU funding from EU ransom and through Europaid. This causes a lot of uncertainty. I've got colleagues working in Barcelona and F4E who feel uncertain of what their jobs are going to be like. But it not only is these direct effects, but there's indirect effects as well, because we look at Euratom, it also gives us access to the safeguards arrangements for export of nuclear materials and moving nuclear materials and nuclear technologies. So that also has an effect on our work elsewhere in the world, in terms of Canada, where we're working with Canadians And those sort of impacts in terms of safeguards do not appear to be properly thought through. We're not confident that the government really understands what needs to be done, and we're running out of time.
That's great. Let's collect a couple more, and then I'll turn to Mike. Yes, there's a lady there. Yeah.
Talk about competitive advantage. I'm the mother of 3 scientists' sons. Sorry, I'm not using the microphone. And my husband's a professor here at the neuroscience department. But I have to say that they're planning to leave the country. My eldest son has left for Amsterdam, taken a job, because he values his European connection. And my youngest son is a geological engineer. He's now in Australia. He left yesterday. And he's working for a Canadian company now. And my middle son, he works for the IFS. And he's fighting Brexit. And they talk about the brain drain, and nobody is picking up. We will lose people. We will lose students. They will look elsewhere.
Thanks very much. Saw another hand, yeah, just there in the back.
I'm a retired biomedical scientist with people that did diagnostic work in the hospital. When I last visited my erstwhile boss a couple of months ago, he was having real difficulty in filling any of his vacancies. We were running, while I was there, we were running on something around 20% European Union staff. This is staff actually on the bench doing the diagnostic work, doing your blood tests, telling the medical staff what's wrong. He's been losing people hand over fist since the Brexit vote, and he's unable to replace them. It seems that the unwelcoming environment, hostile environment even, that word of that is getting around now, and it's difficult to get started. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me take a final contribution for this segment, just because I'm conscious of time. Then I'll get back to Mike and we'll proceed into the next section. I mean, obviously there are some relevant links between the subject areas, so you can contribute there if you wish later.
Two comments to make. I'm a research scientist, and I was at an international meeting on diabetic eye disease on the day of the vote. And when I woke up, I got a text message from my colleague, and he said, "I don't know if it's worth going to breakfast, Irene, we're out." And it's been very difficult, and everyone was devastated, and we found it, because we work in a very small area of research, diabetic eye disease. It's not a big area, and we do need to work very closely with our European colleagues. And I was on a failed Horizon 2020 application, and I've been asked to be on another one which is coming up in the next round. And so we're trying to keep in there, but it is very difficult. And we're also members of something called IVITSI, which is a European Vision research group, and we contribute patients from our hospital into European trials, and we don't know if we'll be able to continue with that. And I'd just like to follow up on the lady over here with her 3 sons. I've got 2 children, and my son's an occupational therapist. He's working in London at the moment, but he's thinking that he may go to Ireland because his wife has is able to get an Irish passport. And my daughter, on the morning of the results, said, "Mum, I'm leaving the country," and she's going to the University of Delft to do a 2-year master's, and she said she's not coming back.
Right.
And nobody seems to be counting how many of these bright young people are going. Yeah. My daughter's 25, she's got a master's from Cambridge. A lot of her friends are going to Barcelona, Berlin, Amsterdam. I met a friend yesterday, his daughter's working in Amsterdam, been there for 2 years, no intention of coming back. And I've spoken to various politicians, and no one seems to know or seems to realise that we're losing these very bright young people who would be the ones coming up in the next generation.
Right. So. On this rather depressing note, Mike, do you want to come back in about a minute or so if there are issues you want to raise, and then we'll carry on?
Yeah, it's not going to take a long time because I think we're all in agreement on these issues. With Euratom, to the gentleman over there, this is a great example of Brexit, where you shoot first and then try to resuscitate later. There was no warning with Euratom. It came completely out of the blue. I was stunned because there had been, before the announcement, 2 inquiries with dozens and dozens of submissions, and it hadn't come out. And then it just got thrown out of the blue without legal necessity. It was all about the European Court of Justice, as the Lords declared. And then there you were with a community of 78,000 people with 2 years to prepare, and they said they couldn't do it. With regard to both of the ladies on either side talking about their children leaving, that is, on one level, that's heart-wrenching because of what we're losing, but also I think it's great for Europe that we get this free flow of talent going, and I think it wakes up a whole generation to, we shouldn't just be here, we should go exploring around. I do hope they come back though, that's all. I hope that we can build a country for them to come back to that's fully part of Europe. And I think that itself should be a bold mission that we should set. And finally, in terms of the filling jobs, yes, lots of people are saying that right across the board. We're losing people, and it's very hard to get the talent in to refill those places when you're looking at the European market. You see that everywhere.
Yeah, and that, I think, is actually a really good segue to move to Nick, who will talk about the effects on the health sector, and the figures that have been released in the last few days are as troubling as they can get. So, Nick.
Thank you very much, and my thanks also to you and your colleagues for organising this evening. I frankly find Brexit at this point, just the whole process, so depressing that it's very easy to want to just not read the newspapers and switch off from all of it, but it's very good to have occasions when we actually can engage with this and maintain some momentum behind it. So thank you very much to you and your colleagues for organising this. I've been working on various aspects of health and health policy and Europe all of my career. As a civil servant, I work for the European Commission. This is one of the few rooms where I can say that without some fear of my safety. But most recently at Oxford. And health is a very interesting area from the point of view of European policy, because if you ask even most European specialists, they'll say, well, but health is a national issue. There's no impact of Europe on health. And it's just not true. And for any of you who had a chance to have a look at the paper, we went through an analysis. Mike's a co-author on that. We decided to say, well, beyond the fears, let's do a real breakdown. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, has a set of dimensions of health systems. And we took each of those and we looked at, well, what is the consequence of Brexit for the NHS? And the short answer is there are consequences across all of them. Every single dimension of a health system, partly because, of course, a health system is not just a thing in isolation. It exists within a society. It exists within an economy. It depends on free movement. It depends on science for reasons that have already been outlined. And so we set out 3 scenarios. We set out a soft Brexit, the sort of the Norway option. We set out a hard Brexit, the Canada option, and what we called a failed Brexit, where we crash out without any kind of agreement. And one thing I want to underline now, and maybe we'll come back to later, colleagues, that isn't off the table yet. There is no agreement on transition. There is a provisional agreement where Barnier and Davis put up a great image of all of the bits of green and white. And the point is, it wasn't all green. There is still a long way to go, and Northern Ireland is just part of that. So we put out these 3 scenarios, and I can say as much more about that as you want to, but the key message was very simple. Any scenario of Brexit has a negative impact on the NHS, and the harder the Brexit, the worse the impact. And that ranges across all sorts of areas, and I'm saved time because some of them have already been highlighted. This health service in the UK is the most dependent upon overseas workers, both from within Europe and outside Europe, of any health service in Europe. We always have been. We've always depended. That's part of what the Windrush generation was about, was bringing people in to help staff the NHS. And we've been relying on European migrants to do that as well. And they've been bringing in enormous skills and expertise, as the gentleman from the diagnostic equipment area already described. We've been talking about rare diseases, where you need to be able to bring together expertise from across Europe. It's not just people. About the ability to develop new products and new therapies, which Mike has already alluded to in terms of the scientific development. But I want to so I don't want to say more about that other than to underline that this is about impacts on the NHS as well. But most of all, beyond any of those technical impacts are the broader social and economic impacts, because the main threat that we identified to the NHS was the threat to our ability to pay for it. Our ability to have a universally accessible health service is dependent on the ability of our economy to generate the wealth that funds that. And I would emphasize this point, the willingness of our society to continue to act in solidarity across everyone across our country. When the Labour government originally put in place the National Health Service, it was revolutionary, and it created a contract. And I think part of what the issue was that underlay the Brexit vote was a feeling by some communities that that fundamental social contract had been broken, and that we didn't have the level of solidarity and collective commitment to the things that we should all be able to benefit from that they thought they'd been promised. Now, that's nothing to do with the European Union. That is to do with austerity and inequality and a failure to direct public services and public funds where people move. And that's not the European Union's fault. But it is a problem that we have to address if we are going to turn around the reactions that brought into place the Brexit vote in the first place. So there is an impact on the NHS. It is critical, both for people living here and for pensioners relying on funding from the NHS and access to health services who are British and have retired elsewhere in Europe. But most of all, I think, it's a touchstone of the social issues which underpin the Brexit vote in the first place. And I think as we go forward, part of how we address and regain the confidence of the country around those issues is to address the underlying social inequalities that led to that degree of dissatisfaction in the first place. And I hope that that's part of what we can discuss and come to later this evening.
Thank you. So in the spirit of asking kind of devilish advocate questions, you've mentioned as one of your primers that this country trains fewer, or relies more, I should say, on staff coming from other countries more than other EU member states do. So that logically suggests that in the short term there's obviously going to be a shortage that will, ironically, perhaps needs to be filled by people coming from outside the EU. But is that something that is that is irredeemable, as it were? Can this not change in the medium to long term? Is it not better, would be the question people will pose, for this to change longer term?
The two things don't contradict each other. So yes, of course it would be better for this country to train enough doctors and nurses and to pay its public service workers enough that people want to choose careers in public service. Because the fundamental, this isn't just about consultants and senior and highly educated medics. Think about social workers. Part of this comes down to the willingness of people, of the country, to pay people enough that they want to choose careers in these areas. And of course it would be better if we trained enough people and we paid them enough. But it isn't just about money and staff. It's about the skills. It's about the mobility. The gentleman has already given the example of the diagnostic science. We gain from having people coming from elsewhere in Europe. Europe is collectively the continent and the place in the world which has the highest commitment to universal access to healthcare anywhere in the world and at any time in human history. And we gain enormously from pooling the expertise that mobility of people across that space gives to us. So yes, of course we should train more people, but that's not an answer to the challenges that Brexit throws up in that area.
Okay, perfect. I've got plenty more, but I would defer to others. Any comments or questions in the area of health specifically that people in the audience wish to engage in? Surely, that's pretty much. Yeah, and we'll start here and then move here.
You might be able to answer this more than I know myself, so I'm not an expert. The mobility of people from outside the EU coming to work for the NHS, I think it was Dan Hammond said last week, great, we can bring people from India. And I pointed out saying that there's a bit of a problem there because it's 9 hours away for a start off, costs a lot of money which people don't have, and if you want to get young sort of single females to come and work here, culturally it's not the norm. So attracting people here who can actually go back and see their families at weekends or once a month or something, which you can do in the EU. How can you attract people from further away?
Do you want to come? Do you want to collect a few things? Yeah. That's if that's all right. We'll try and get through a few and then. But note those down. There's another lady here, I think.
And the other thing that seems to have come up very recently is that doctors can't be recruited now because the Home Office has set a target and that target has been reached. And I just think these two things are so amazing.
We'll take a final.
As a sentence to add on to that, the target has been reached within the health service because of the number of nurses that have been admitted. The logic of that argument is cut the nurses in order to get more doctors.
Okay, is there a final contribution before I turn back to Nick? There's somebody in the back.
How is leaving Euratom going to affect chemotherapy options for cancer patients?
Okay, I think you've got your hands full now, so go at it.
Let me take it in order of. So let me start with the lady over here and the insanity of the immigration approach. I hope you're not expecting me to come up with some kind of an answer to that, because I don't have one, frankly. What I will do is, in my declaration of interests or introduction for the event, one of the things that I've been doing is advising the Health Select Committee. And in the evidence for the Health Select Committee's Brexit inquiries, they thought there would only be one, there won't, was made the point that at the moment we seem to define the value of people coming to the country by how much they're paid. And that cannot be right, because it means that all your public sector workers, who are almost universally worse paid than on average their private sector counterparts, are of less value to our society and our economy. And so the point was made that we should have some kind of public sector weighting, needs weighting within immigration. And that would be sensible, but it would also be a sticking plaster, because what we need to address is the mentality that somehow people coming to the country is a problem. That's a wider issue. On the whole point of how this works in terms of people coming from India, from the Caribbean, from the Philippines, from the other places that the John Radcliffe Hospital is currently desperately trying to recruit nurses from, you've eloquently described the human difficulties of this. there is another wider issue. The UK has been front and centre for the World Health Organization for decades now, as basically robbing developing countries of the trained staff that they need for their health systems. This isn't just about us. This is about India and the Caribbean and the Philippines. They need those nurses. They need those doctors. And so there is a... You asked earlier, Ruvi, about can't we just train people? Yes. Absolutely, we should be training people, and not just for us, but for these other countries. Yeah. But in the short term, and by the short term I mean at least the next decade, that's not an answer. And we're going to have to either live with a woefully understaffed NHS that we are then spending more money to hire contract staff to cover the gaps of, or we will end up creating exactly these kinds of problems. Euratom is the lady who asked the very good Euratom question. That question is so good that not only do I not know the answer to it, but the government doesn't either. Because this has come up in the context of the Health Select Committee, and we asked exactly this question, and I think now 3 select committees have asked this in different ways and been given subtly different answers. And my colleague who's been advising is a law professor, and we've tried to understand the government's answers on exactly what they think is going to happen with Euratom after we leave, and we still don't have a clear answer on that question. But the long and we had evidence from a specialist in this who was talking through, and if you're interested, please have a look at her evidence. It's available on the Health Select Committee website. And she's talking about the fact that some of these isotopes decay over a number of hours. So it's not even just the legal, can we do this, safeguards, membership, all these radioisotopes come from sources outside the UK. It's not even all of that. Just imagine if this particular transit mechanism is stuck at Dover for 5 hours. Yes. Half of the radioisotopes of what the NHS has paid for you begin to lose the effectiveness of that. So it comes down also to the sheer logistics of not just what is happening within the specific regulatory environment for Euratom, but also the wider, what on earth is our future relationship with the rest of Europe, which impacts obviously on business, on the wider economy and all of those processes.
Yeah. So I think that will be a good segue to talk about business. Perhaps Antony could indulge us in that.
Certainly. Right, good evening everyone. So I'm the managing director of an electronics company called Solid State Logic, which is based just outside Oxford. We employ about 140 people locally, and we make equipment for the music and broadcast industries. Equipment is manufactured here in the UK, and we export about 90% of our output, about 25% of it to other EU countries. So in my career with the company, I've built much of our international distribution network, and I travel regularly to Europe, the USA, Japan, and other industrialized countries. In recent months, I've attended a number of meetings with the Thames Valley's Chambers of Commerce and other business-oriented groups concerned about Brexit. So I'm sure you've heard many times businesses saying that they want stability and predictability. The government has exhorted businesses to prepare for Brexit, but when the CBI or the FSB or the Chambers of Commerce say, what sort of Brexit should we prepare for, there's no coherent answer. Why is there no coherent answer? Well, one, because the government doesn't appear to have a coherent view of what it can realistically achieve, and 2, because it's in the middle of a negotiation anyway, and by its very nature can't know what the outcome will be. So this leaves businesses in an uncertain position, the very, very thing that they like least. You'll also have heard how some large companies, including some from the finance sector, are starting to move some of their operations to European centres. This is not an option for the vast majority of UK companies whose employees and their skills are their most valuable asset. In all of the meetings I've attended, and I've been to quite a few with other business leaders, I haven't heard a single voice that thinks that leaving the EU is a good idea. So business really does have a unified voice about this. In my own company, in order to sustain our main source of competitive advantage, we've recruited graduates and postgraduates from other EU countries, many of them into our 50-strong R&D team. These people, specialists in their fields, are important to our continued success. In the past year, we've lost 3 of them, who've returned to their home countries, citing Brexit as a contributory factor in their decision. Even more worrying is the huge decline we've seen in job applications from other EU countries. We seem to have already poisoned the well. Oxfordshire is one of the country's leading technology centres. Technological collaboration and the ability to recruit specialists from a wider pool than is available in the UK are absolutely essential to our ability to contribute both at a local and a national level. Not surprising then that Oxford was one of the strongest Remain voting areas in the country. Now, recently there's been a lot of focus on the idea that some form of break from the EU that allows the UK to stay in a customs union might be a practical compromise. Let me just say very clearly that anything that removes the UK's ability to trade freely across borders with other EU countries would be nothing short of catastrophic. The current customs clearing system is already at the limit of its capacity for the number of transactions it can process. The massive increase that would occur if the UK was outside a customs union with the EU would bring our ports to a virtual standstill. An expert in this field told me that it would take up to 5 years and a great deal of money to implement a new customs system that could cope with the increased demand. After 40 years within the EU, the supply chains of many businesses rely on the smooth operation of cross-channel ports. The delays and additional costs and paperwork that would come with a departure from the customs union would make a significant number of UK businesses unviable, with consequent job losses. Now, the UK has already got the slowest growth of most EU economies, largely because of the fallout from the Brexit vote. Every version of Brexit that's been discussed is forecast to compound this impact on this country's economic performance. If there is an exit from the EU, this will not only affect businesses and jobs, but the government's ability to fund the NHS, social care, education, infrastructure, etc., etc. You may have noticed that I said if there's an exit. I am enough of an optimist to believe that the practical obstacles, let alone the sheer stupidity, will cause the project to be abandoned. So I hope for all our sakes I'm right, and if you're sat here asking yourself, what can I do about it? I recommend voting in the council elections for candidates who have clearly expressed their support for overturning the collective madness that we're currently having to endure.
Thanks very much, Anthony. So, I mean, the latest figure on GDP, as you've mentioned, is 0.1% growth for the first quarter in 2018. Which was far below projections, which to begin with were already pretty low given where we are. So the UK is now by far, and it gives no one pleasure to say this, the slowest growing economy in the G7. But again, in the spirit of kind of asking slightly less favourable questions here, if we were to move to a form by which we have regulatory divergence, are there any areas that businesses that you're familiar with would identify as areas where being not subject to EU regulation might benefit them competitively internationally?
I can't think of one to answer your question directly. I think one of the things that you might be interested to be aware of is that the contribution of UK experts to the creation of standards within the EU is very widely recognised within the other countries in the EU. If we depart the Union and start to adopt different standards, we are going to create a massive bureaucracy of then trying to have our products and services matching EU regulations when we want to export back to the EU. So it is a complete minefield. I often think about the whole EU process as far as it affects business is an iceberg. You can see the top bit of all of the problems, but believe you me, underneath the surface there is another 9 times as many problems that aren't immediately obvious.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Anthony. And of course, we'll return both to the issue of customs union and the way in which we might exit from Brexit at the what next stage. So thanks for the primer on that as well. So again, as per earlier, I invite contributions, and there are plenty. So we'll walk from yes. All right. We'll come back to you first.
Hello there, my name is Tom. I work for a company called Sophos. It's a cybersecurity company. Brexit will not have a good impact on that company. It's not having an immediate impact, but it employs a lot of people across Europe, quite a high percentage. It's a very high-skilled tech company, and it's not going to have a good impact. I think the top brass in our company is already starting to look at Abingdon as a potential, which is where the company is based, as a potential weak spot company because of Brexit. So that's just that statement. But I did have a question, and it was, I would have thought that a Conservative government would probably involve lots of people from lots of different demographics, but the one kind of body of organisations or people they would probably strongly listen to would be businesses, large businesses and banks, financial corporations, etc. But it seems to me they're blind to even that. So I'd be interested to hear what the panel think about that.
That's great. I'll come back to you earlier, but later rather.
Following on from that, you say you don't know of others in similar positions to yourself who support Brexit. My basic question follows on. How representative are the organisations for employers? During the referendum debate, and I was then chairman of the European Movement branch here, we organised a similar meeting to this. The Federation of Small Business would not answer letters inviting them to have somebody on the panel. When we had a debate, they wouldn't take part in the debate. CBI clearly is being more critical. But the other employers' organisations, are they speaking up on this issue? Are you representative, or is this a local phenomenon? Do you think you can speak for colleagues with employers of 140 like yourselves nationwide? Are they all feeling the same? And do their organisations really represent your views?
Okay, perfect. There was one other hand at the back, or two now, yes. Yeah, I can see that, thank you.
I know it's all about discussing the impact of Brexit today, but it's actually beginning to depress me quite significantly this evening. So I was wondering if the perfect scenario arrives and we get a second referendum, which is what a lot of people are campaigning for, how do we make the message so positive that they get it right next time?
Okay, we may save this very important question till the final stage, if that's all right, of the evening. There was one other question I thought at the, yes, Karen, if you can see, at the very end there, yes. And then I'll come back to the front.
Okay, sorry to be a bit depressing, but I just want to say I'm very depressed by all this. But I actually had a market research company, and we operated globally, and we particularly worked out of Europe. And you hear all the Brexiteers talking about how liberated we will be to be able to trade globally. Well, I was trading very happily through Europe, and because we were so strong in Europe, we could then operate globally, because my biggest client was Unilever, and it was very obvious to all of us that Unilever were definitely going to be leaving the UK after Brexit, although they wanted to deal with the government to pretend it was a variety of other things. So in the end, all the headwinds that were coming at us, including post-recession, technology, etc., Brexit for me was the big tipping point, and I actually closed my business because all the budgets and all the decision-making was coming out of Rotterdam and Hamburg now, not out of London. London was like the most dominant area in market research and advertising services, which is the world I operate in. But frankly, I saw the writing on the wall and I closed the business. And one thing, building on what other people are saying, is I'm not a conservative, but I did think surely the Conservatives would care about business. So what I'm interested in is, are you speaking to your local MPs who are, I don't know if they're Tory or not, but do they care? Do they seem to mind the fact that all these businesses are going to be in deep, deep trouble and not paying their taxes or whatever? But that's my question. So a sad story on one side, and also my son is planning to go to Berlin as fast as he can, if he's allowed to go, because I presume some of these people who are too young are going to get stuck here and can't escape. So I'm afraid depression all round, but we are fighting, because look at my t-shirt, and we are Oxford for Europe, so we're still trying.
Great. There are two further questions here. I think we'll then have to leave it at that, but we might return to other questions at the final stage, or well, the penultimate stage, rather.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed. I want to ask a question which has partly been asked already again. That is, why if business is voting Remain on a large scale, why are they not shouting from the rooftops about it? I was in Brussels 3 weeks ago, speaking to some businesses there. I asked that same question, and the reply I got was very puzzling. They said that they did not want to frighten people.
It's a very good question. And then finally, yes, please.
Okay, I'll try and keep this quiet. This is going to brief, sorry. This will probably join up everything we've just been talking about now. I've worked in the private and public sectors for a long time. Currently, project manager. I work with 3,000 project managers for the government. To get anything to a business case, anything large, takes about 2-3 years just to get to a business case. So any of the decisions that we need to be making for custom systems, IT systems, border protection, everything, none of that is even going to be in the design stage for 2 years. So once we get to the design stage and actually having it put into build stage, that's when they've actually made a decision. You're looking at a minimum of 5 years to actually get it to beta stage. So anything that we think we're going to be able to do in the timescales we have is a problem. We put that into the private sector, sorry, the public sector. Any company that's trying to create a business case for actually having a continuity plan for what's happening, how we're going to deal with Brexit, you need to be thinking way ahead. Someone like Airbus needs to be thinking 5 or 10 years ahead. If you're going to have to move all your infrastructure, or like you're saying, your staff, retrain them, teach them different languages, whatever, you can't do that until the government's made a decision. So if the government's going to take then 10 years to actually get to that level, that's going to be a huge problem. My last point, Labour, as we all know, are saying we can leave everything to the last minute. If we do that, it will be catastrophic on a level that nobody has any clue about. Now, I just want to say very, very briefly, going back to my work in government at the moment, when I first started working there, I was stunned that nobody knew what an interdependency was in the project. Nobody had considered working between different projects, how they work together. And there was nobody in the government that is working on Brexit now that is looking at every sector because they have no knowledge whatsoever of what they're supposed to be doing and building a model because it is too complex. It will take 10 years to build a model which will give a rough idea of what Brexit will do.
Right. So we've got questions about long-term planning, about why business isn't making noise, about how you utilize local MPs, about whether what you're saying is representative of various business groupings, and more generally about how this affects businesses. Quite a lot.
Yeah, let me just take the last point first, because I completely agree with you. And it's actually that very reason that I think makes the whole Brexit thing totally impractical, which is why it'll never happen. The number of comments about business not being listened to, you're entirely wrong. The government is listening very carefully to the business concerns of Rupert Murdoch, Paul Dacre, and the Berkshire brothers. Unfortunately, it's not listening to the rest of business, and that is a matter of shame and embarrassment to someone who comes from that community. I was at a meeting recently in Reading at the headquarters of Microsoft with about 25 other business people, most of them from big companies, and I was doing my best to stick up for SMEs. And this very question was debated there, and a lot of people in the room who spoke up about the madness of Brexit under the Chatham House rule, when challenged about why they weren't going to put their heads up above the parapet, cited their HR departments, their marketing departments, their CEO, their blah, 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 about why they didn't want to put their heads above the parapet because it wouldn't be good for business. This is useless, frankly, and people from business sector really, really do need to stand up. Now, I'm also embarrassed to say that I don't think the CBI or the FSB have done a very good job either. I'm particularly cross about the CBI because they do have the clout. The FSB has never been particularly strong in its sort of campaigning, but the CBI definitely does have the voice of government, and it's not getting listened to. One of the last meetings I attended had two representatives from BEIS at the meeting. These are civil servants at a sort of middle level who were there to listen and take the message back. And I got talking to them after the meeting, and I said, okay, so what happens when you take all this back to your ministers? And they say, well, yes, we do take it back, but generally, if it's not the message they want to hear, then they just go nah, 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 and they choose not to listen. So I'm afraid sort of doctrinaire behaviour at the centre of our government is what's blocking it. But the reluctance of businesses to get involved is a matter of concern, and I do what I can, but I think there's a lot more that businesses could be doing. Yeah, I mean, the issue of companies taking their businesses abroad, I think largely this is a luxury that bigger businesses can afford. As I mentioned in my talk earlier, I think most smaller businesses depend on the people, the infrastructure and the skills that they already have, and they just don't have the luxury. I mean, something like 70% of jobs in this country are people employed by SMEs, and while your Unilevers and your Marses and your Nestle's and Microsofts might be able to move things abroad, companies like ours just can't do it. We just can't afford to do it. So that's a massive challenge as well. I think I've addressed most of those questions, haven't I?
Yeah. Well, in an ironic way, the fact that at least some businesses can move their businesses at least means those people don't lose their jobs. But it's or some of them. I mean, if you want to look for kind of very, very small comforts of what you've just outlined. Perhaps we're talking about people. We'll move to Catherine, who will talk to us about how this affects people, how this affects EU27 citizens here, how this affects UK citizens elsewhere in the EU, and what does the European Parliament try to do for us on this?
Actually, I'm going to stand up because I like to see who I'm talking to, and being little, it's easier to see over the tops of the heads. Yes, I'm not on the Brexit steering group in the Parliament, which is the negotiating committee. Guy Verhofstadt chairs that committee. He's the leader of the Liberal group in the Parliament, and I sit in his group. As a Liberal Democrat, I have always been in favour of cooperatively working with international organisations, so I am pro-European to my fingertips. I was during the referendum, I still am, and I'm still fighting it. So I'm delighted to see so many people here in Oxford, but I am aware that there are millions of people out there who are not talking about Brexit, and I think that's something that we perhaps can come back to. But Brexit can be stopped, and I think we need to work on that. Now, you've asked me to talk about citizens. And what I call Brexit citizens, and there are two groups really that we're dealing with, and that's Brits who are living elsewhere in the European Union, and there are European, non-British European citizens living in the UK, because we're of course at the moment, we are all European citizens, so we mustn't forget that. And I think it's worth remembering that a great number of those, certainly the Europeans in the UK, had no vote in the referendum. So although they have been here for decades, some of them still had no vote. But they don't have a vote because they had never taken over citizenship of the UK. And why would they? They didn't need to until that referendum. So they were denied a vote on their future. And I think that is almost criminal. And many of the Brits living elsewhere, once they've lived overseas for 15 years, they lose their right to vote in this country. And there are millions of them, well, certainly at least a million. I think that's a very conservative estimate. So there are main issues for those who are living in the EU. Now, in December, we had an agreement that David Davis and Barnier put together, and there was what was called Article 32 in that agreement that actually stated that Brits living elsewhere in the EU would not maintain their freedom of movement after Brexit. Very worrying. So that when if they are living in France, they then lose their right to move anywhere else in the European Union. So that's really worrying. I have a very good friend in Brussels. She is a media trainer. She trains people in public speaking and performing in front of the TV. She works all across the European Union. So if she loses that right to move, she is landlocked in Belgium. I mean, there are worse fates in the world, but for her whole business collapses. Now, when we got to March and we saw that the Barnier's, the agreement and the final text, Article 32, the whole paragraph disappeared. Just vanished. So we don't quite know what that means. I wrote to David Davis and asked him, what have you agreed between you and Barnier? I'm still waiting for that reply. And so, you know, there is a huge concern for those people who are living elsewhere in the European Union. So, but the Europeans living here have now we have a Home Office that is telling us it's fine. We're writing a programme. They were in the Parliament this week, and they were telling us about this wonderful whizzy computer programme that is going to sort all their issues out. Now, those of us who know, we've just heard about computer programmes. They've only been doing this 3 or 4 months. And they're going to have phone apps so that they can put it on your phone. Oh, but it only works on Android. It doesn't work on iPhone, so that, you know, that's okay. And you can just do it. Well, so he actually said in a meeting, well, those people that don't have iPhones can borrow an Android. Now you're going to be putting your own data in here, date of birth, or on you know, just pop down the road and get somebody there. So there's all of that issue. Those of you who might have TSB bank accounts or farmers waiting for their farm payments when the computer program crashed will know that this is really, really worrying for those people. And the group, the 3 million, meet regularly, almost every week with the Home Office, and what they're telling us about this program is eye-watering. And, you know, people's lives are complicated. They've made decisions on their status of having the right to move freely around the European Union. If you are not a European citizen and you migrate to the UK from, say, India or Singapore or wherever else in the world, you have the right to bring your spouse to this country if you come here and reside and get a permanent residency. Europeans do not have that right because they didn't need to. So it's not in anybody's law. Now, this is the sort of thing that we're really worried about. How are we going to ensure that people's rights are retained on a promise that we were giving them? And of course, Windrush has really brought this home. Windrush citizens came to this country as citizens of the UK, or subjects it was then in the 50s. Yeah. And then at some point between the 50s and now, they've actually lost their citizenship, and they now find, so that's 40 years. What we've been told by the European Union is we will have 8 years to go to the ECJ, and that seemed quite a long time. Now it seems a very short time. So I actually heard about a 90-year-old lady who, when she inquired about her right, she'd come here when she was 20 from France. She inquired about what happens, I don't have a British passport. And she was told, well, if you can't apply for settled status, you will be deported. And I find, you know, and she was in floods of tears, and I find that heartbreaking. That a government who says they stand here for the people and standing up for democracy do that sort of thing to people who have worked for this country, have family, children, everybody here, and so what we're doing in the Parliament is the following things. We are trying to ring fence whatever deal we manage to get for the citizens of the Brexit citizens. That has to be ring-fenced. Because as we've heard, in these international agreements, nothing is agreed till everything's agreed. So if we don't get an agreement on Northern Ireland, the citizens' deal collapses, the trade deals collapse, all of that collapses. We have to have cost-free, easy registration. Now you should be able to go to your post office or fill in a form for the whole family. We have to have enforcement. We have to have independent enforcement. If we're not having the ECJ, then the government are going to have to set up an independent enforcement process. And we need to make sure that future partners, so that if you do marry or form a relationship, that they have rights to enter this country for there. So there's a lot that we are still working on. I'm working cross-party in the Parliament. I'm also working with the Citizens for Europe there. We are fighting for that, but there are two very good organisations. One is the 3 million who are working in this country for European citizens. The other one is, yeah, I'm just finishing now, is Britons in Europe. And they all need your support and your money, and follow them on Twitter and retweet and write to your MPs about this the citizens issue. It's heartbreaking. I mean, all of these issues are heartbreaking, but for me, the citizens that we invited to this country, who've built the health service for us, who've built the scientific industries, who've built our businesses, are being kicked in the teeth without any secure future, and that's, for me, unacceptable. Thank you.
Great. So again, before I open this for people's questions for about 10 minutes or so before we move to the next steps stage, I have more kind of two comments rather than really questions. One is another issue that doesn't appear in that Barnier table and is very relevant to next week's elections, and that is the retention of rights to vote and to be elected in local elections. That is something that at the moment the United Kingdom is not willing to guarantee to the 3 million EU 27 citizens, or I should say 24, because Irish, Maltese and Cypriots do have, through other arrangements, the right to vote here, but the other 24 member states have citizens here who are about to potentially be disenfranchised, and the same as it stands applies across the European Union for Britons there, unless there is an arrangement. So I think that's something I hope that perhaps will be added on and part of the ring fence if there will be agreement. The other is, I noticed carefully that you said there should be a simple registration process. Of course, part of the problem and part of what we see with Windrush as well is that the Home Office's approach is that this isn't registration, it's an application process. And it's an application process in which applications, as applications go, may be unsuccessful. And we know, in addition to a 10% error rate, that's about 300,000 people, there are also just unsuccessful applications because they will not be able to operate the software properly, because they won't have the documents, because they missed you know, a deadline, etc. We are looking at pretty awful scenarios, unless it is, as you rightly, I think, demand, registration, which is very, very different. So I don't know if you want to comment on these or...
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's, they are here by right. And there's another piece of legislation going through Westminster at the moment. It's the data protection legislation, which is, okay, it's about data protection, blah, 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 blah. But in there, it says immigration data is exempt from this. So if you have a record at the Home Office of your immigration status, you will not be able to access that. Because they are building into the new law an opt-out for the government to be able to give you your data on that. So, I mean, you know, so it's not just the Brexit negotiations and the bill that comes out of that at the end. It's other legislation that they are nibbling away at people's rights. And for them to say that we're doing the will of the people, well, for me, this is not the will of the people. Because if you ask people, if you walk down the streets and ask them, you know, the Polish shopkeeper that you know, or the Romanian bus driver, or the nurse that you know at your local health centre, they don't want them to go home, but it's always the other. And that's how the right-wing press and really the conservative right wing that is running the government at the moment, and it's a tiny minority. And for me, the frustration is that the MPs who are there, who were Remainers, who are just sitting on their hands when they should be standing up for it. And for me, if you could do anything tonight, just go and talk to an MP, go to their surgeries, not just a letter. Go and look them in the eye and say, why are you not standing up for this country? Because the future of all of us, especially the young people, is being challenged.
Yeah. Right, and I imagine we'll return to action points, as you were, just in a few minutes' time. But before we get there, I'm conscious that I want to bring in more people on citizens' rights, and I'll start with people who haven't spoken yet, and then I'll come to others. So if you can start there, please, and if you can note down.
I would like to say that people from the UK as citizens, with their citizens' rights, not as immigrants, although that of course is okay as well. And these rights have just been voted away from us over our heads. There are heartbreaking things going on, but they're not only heartbreaking, they're infuriating and they are insulting. And one thing I find very difficult to understand and to bear is the complete lack of interest in our situation of wide parts of the population.
Thank you.
I've looked at the process of applying for permanent residency in the UK, and I think the burden of proof you have to bring is discriminatory because it's against pensioners, because you have to bring proof of employment when you have been retired over a decade. That is very, very difficult. You do no longer have all the invoices they want, like council tax, like utility invoices. In fact, the council tax office doesn't have those invoices, nor the utilities. You're supposed to bring bank statements, and they only keep statements for 6 years. You can't get any. So it's discriminatory against older people. It's discriminatory against women who may not have had employment and may have been housewives, and people who are invalids. And what are what's going to be done about that? Is that legal?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, of course, at the moment, there is no obligation to register. The whole point of the process is that at the moment people are here by right, and registration just confirms it, and that's the big difference. Any questions at the back? If not, then sorry. Yeah. So let me start here because he hasn't spoken yet, and then I'll.
Thank you, Catherine. As always, well spoken and some very good points. I'll just build a bit on the points about the threats to democracy. Because obviously democracy has been used, I think we're abused mostly by the Leave side as a defence for their views and behaviour. And it seems to me that as an Irish person who's lived here for many years, I've always been rather unhappy about how people are content with the voting system in the UK. We have currently in my constituency a Conservative MP with a 55,000 majority who is not going to be unseated anytime soon, and he excels, and another person, because he's like many of his colleagues, excels at the art of doing what he's told by his boss. And we have no chance of being heard at Westminster for that reason. I think about 1/3 of the population of the UK does. In contrast, however, Catherine's a shining example of the fact that Brussels is different. The European Union, the European Parliament is elected by a system which empowers every single voter. Unfortunately, we're not many people who realise that. And therefore, what we're actually doing in proposing to leave is to give up the only significant vote which directly affects our future, the vote for the European Parliament. And I really feel sad, and I'm better at communicating this to people at large. The other threat, of course, is the fact that if the Leave side are seen to get away with an act of, frankly, democratic fraud, I think that's, in view of the latest events, it's nothing other than that. That will empower other people to do the same, and therefore, it's just about allowing this to happen. If you win a medal at the Olympics, it's taken away when you cheat, and the same should apply.
Okay, we'll return to perhaps that theme later. I'll just very quickly from our colleagues here, and then we'll go back to Catherine. Yeah, repeated offenders doesn't matter.
Thank you very much. I and many of us have European friends living in this country, young people. I had a Spanish friend of mine come to me the other day and say, Antony, I have a Spanish passport. I don't know what to do. What documentation should I seek to apply for now to secure my position in this country? Therefore, can I ask you, what documentation should people from other European countries ask for now, in order to secure a position after Brexit in this country?
And finally, yes.
Okay, slightly into that, and slightly into what Catherine was saying earlier, there's a follow-on story to the iPhone app, which I don't know if you're aware of. The 3 million, one of the guys from the 3 million actually tried to use the application and it failed. And he contacted the help desk and he said, I don't have a passport, like probably 70 or 80% of EU citizens here uses an ID card. And there was silence at the end of the phone. They had not even considered that people didn't have a passport because it needs a chip for the application to run. So if they can't get that running, how can they expect to get 300 border crossings on the Irish border to work on a number plate recognition system which hasn't even been designed or been conceived and is impossible?
Right. So if you could respond in a couple of minutes, if you can.
Yeah, I think to the lady that said that European citizens have rights, and I think that is something that I've been really heartened by Guy Verhofstadt's stand, that the Parliament stands, we are elected by the citizens, we are your representatives in the European Union and the various bodies. And he is very strong that we should be standing up for European citizens. And he has promised if we're not content with the deal that he's done, then we have the veto over the whole deal. The problem with that, of course, is if we dump the deal, everything collapses. So, but the European Parliament is working overtime, really, to sort out the issue. But it's not being easy because the government, as we've just heard, getting that proof is hugely difficult. And doing it retrospectively is a nightmare for anybody who is having to apply, and as I said, for older people, especially women who have had caring responsibilities. You don't have any paper from your kids to prove that you were at home looking after them. You know, that's what you need is some sort of proof, and it's very difficult to get. And that is why I'm sort of saying, well, maybe if you're a certain age, if you're past retirement age, you shouldn't need that. You should just get a letter from your doctor or your vicar or something, and that should be enough. But we have a government that likes widgy things, and they like things that scan things that we don't actually have in our pocket. As to your Spanish friend, I think it's going to have to be a case of, if she has a Spanish passport, when she comes backwards and forwards, demand that that passport is stamped when she comes in to the UK. Start saving all the sorts of things. If she goes to the health centre for a checkup, to scan that and keep the you know, any piece of data that you can have that proves that you've been here, you've been working, and you're legally here. You need to keep that information now. I mean, it's getting late, and we're talking about leaving the European Union in March, and it's not a year away, and they haven't yet done the Can you imagine how much money the TSB have put into getting their website, their online banking correct? How long is it now that it's been down? Almost a week now. So, you know, if a huge bank like that can't get just moving from one programme to the next, right, how on earth is the government going to get this done properly? And as you said, the border at Northern Ireland, David Davis will say it's just easy, we can do it easily with technology will solve all our problems. Hey ho.
Right. So with that in mind, we're going to move into the what's next step. So I'm going to call Craig in a minute. What I want to say kind of as a primer for this section is sort of highlighting two developments that I'm sure people are aware of, but I think are helpful for framing some of our discussions, and I think both of them in one way or another have been mentioned already. One is pressures on the government in respect of staying in the customs union. So people will know that the House of Lords voted as part of amendments to the EU withdrawal bill by a fairly sizable majority, so 348 to 225 on an amendment about a customs union. And the Commons yesterday did not divide, so resolved without a division, because the government did not want to put the resolution to a vote, but resolved that it shall be the objective of an appropriate authority to take all necessary steps to implement an international trade agreement which enables the UK to participate after exit day in a customs union with the European Union. And we might not get into the minutiae of the A versus in D customs union, but it's quite interesting that the government did not want to have a vote. And for those of you who watched at least part of that debate or read it on Hansard, you will note that with the exception, I think, of the member for Vauxhall, there wasn't a single member who actually presented a case for leaving a customs union. The other big development of recent weeks is the launch of the People's Vote campaign, the 15th of April in London, which is a cross-party campaign, I believe, in the launch were Chuka Omuna, Anna Soubry, Leila Moran and Caroline Lucas, amongst various other people, including Mike, I think. Were you there?
I wasn't. I was just an audience, yeah.
Well, I saw you in pictures. So. But they are planning a big march on referendum day, as you were, on the 23rd of June. But there's a question for the panellists, both in relation to the customs union and in relation to the People's Vote. Are these developments that we should be encouraged by? How do we take them forward? How do we pressurize or use them as pressure points to get to a better resolution, as you were? So I will invite the panelists to comment on one or both or on other matters as they wish to in respect of the next steps. Before I turn to them, can I call Craig Simmons to come and join us? He's a Green councillor on the Oxford City Council. He's chair of the finance panel of the council, in which capacity he commissioned a report on the impact of Brexit on Oxford's economy, and I'm sure he has a strong view on these issues. So perhaps we start with Craig and then move down the line.
Thank you, Ruvi. And he gave me the unenviable task of talking about what next, because obviously it's hugely depressing, and I agree with 100% of what's been said. But we have to look forward. And I hope I bring an interesting perspective to this. I'm obviously a concerned individual, as everyone else is here in the audience, otherwise you wouldn't be here. I'm also, as Ruvi says, a politician, and a Green one at that. And everyone has, and many people here will be active politically. But also, people might not know, I'm actually a businessman as well, and I'm a director of a large and successful company that's actually the 4th largest management consultancy in Europe. So I also have that as a interesting dimension. So I've tried to write down some things under each of those sort of facets of my life, what I think would be areas that you couldn't do next, what activism you could do. And I hope this provides useful, sort of fruitful framework for debate. And much of it's been said, so I won't dwell on it. I've just got them down as a series of bullet points. But the first thing, as an individual, as a concerned individual, I think the first most important thing you do is don't accept Brexit as inevitable. And it's easily done because you start slipping into the media debates around it. And I think the moment you start doing it and say, well, this is the less worse option, you're already on a slippery slope. And I think it's important to remember that. And there is reasons for hope, and we've got cracks appearing in Labour and the Conservatives, as you've seen in the debates. We've got the People's Poll, which has been mentioned, which I think is a really exciting cross-party initiative. And we have got, albeit a symbolic vote on the customs union that happened this week, where the government, in effect, lost. And I think that's really important going forward. So there is hope, so don't give up hope, don't accept Brexit as inevitable. On a political side, and we're all active politically, whether we know it or not, in various guises, and I think my message there is to keep the debate public. Do whatever you can politically to keep the debate alive, not to accept that there's an agenda there, because it leads on to people accepting the inevitable, and we mustn't do that. So, and I'll just give an example of how it can work. So, before the referendum, I represent St Mary's Ward, which is an area in East Oxford. In fact, Catherine's one of my constituents, and I'm her constituent. So, but she'll know that up until that referendum, the Greens and other political parties also pro-EU were knocking on doors, and and it was very active in East Oxford, and we were going around and talking to people and leafleting them, and I gave out thousands of leaflets and knocked on thousands of doors, and I was one of many. And that area, and I think it was one of the more active areas in the country, got 90% Remain vote. And I think that shows what having a debate and keeping the debate open can do. It starts to get people to think, it starts to get people informed, it educates people. And that's just so critical. And that spreads across to other aspects of the sort of political process. So continue to build cross-party political consensus, that's also extremely important. And, as a councillor, I put motions to council on the, I think we're up to 3rd or 4th motion from the Greens and the Lib Dems on that. It's coming up to local elections, vote for a pro-EU party. And don't just vote. And don't just vote, but tell them why you're voting for a pro, because that's really important, and it's often forgotten. People need to know, write to your MP, but also the canvasser that turns up on your doorstep, or the candidate standing in election. Tell them why you're not voting for them. And I think that's extremely powerful. And finally, in a sort of role as a sort of businessman, and this is where it gets quite difficult, as has been said before, because there is a groundswell, and I think majority of business people in this country are anti-Brexit, but there is a significant minority which are pro-Brexit. And that's embodied by the Department of Exiting the EU, David Davis's department. I've had meetings with the civil servants there, and the first question they ask you when you come through the door as a businessman is, what regulations would you like to get rid of? And that's really shocking. So my message for people who are employers or employees or working is, do not go down that path, resist it. And it's so easy to say when you're offered that question, oh, this regulation, we talked about the GDPR regulations, the security, that's something which a lot of businesses don't like. Air quality regulations, water quality regulations. So don't go down that route. Go down another route, which is going to seem harsh, but you know, as a businessman, you protect shareholder value, you look for certainty. That's inevitable in businesses. You have to look for alternatives. You have to look to invest elsewhere. You have to look to move your business elsewhere. Now that seems really harsh, but unless you tell the government that's what you're intending to do, they will not change. So those were my messages. A harsh one from the businesses: you have to communicate as a business person what you're intending to do to safeguard your businesses. You know, keep the debate open as a politician, as a concerned individual. Don't accept Brexit as inevitable. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Craig. I will continue down the line. I just want to introduce the other panelists who just joined us. Joan Tanner, who is the Secretary of the Oxford European Association. He's also a Labour councillor representing Littlemore. We will hear from John his perspective. So just to fill it in on the vote on the customs union and on the People's Vote campaign in particular, but also on other alternatives or other areas where we are looking for next steps, as you were. So Nick, if you want to come in.
Thank you. Before I say this next thing, I'm just going to clarify that this is very much the stage where I take off my expert and certainly my University of Oxford hat. So please don't blame either of those, you know, anything that institution for anything I might say next. Two things. One is, both the major parties are, I think, still seeing this in party and government and power terms. And I say this as a card-carrying member of the Labour Party. And I think one of the most important shifts that I would want to try and communicate is that this is not about who's in the next government. This is about the future of this country. This is about... And in the same way as we've talked a lot about, you know, why aren't they listening to business? I've had the experience of talking to a number of members of Parliament recently, and senior members of both parties. They know it makes no sense. They know that this isn't going to work, but they feel that they are bound into electoral positions which they can't get out of. That's what we have to try and shift, I think, is to make clear that actually the judgment of this will be a judgment of history and it will be a judgment of generations. And for example, I said to a senior Conservative Member of Parliament recently, do you not think that actually if this succeeds, it will destroy the Conservative Party? And they said yes. They know this. So it's about trying to get them to look past the next election, and that's an incredibly hard thing to do for an elected politician. And then we talked, so that's the first thing I wanted to say. It's about shifting the focus from who's in government to what kind of country we are. And that would bring me to the second point. Believe me, I've done my time. I worked for the European Commission. I can do mind-numbing procedural detail at weapons grade. I can bore for Britain. Trust me. And that's the mistake that we made in the referendum campaign. I did a lot of these meetings, and I spent the first 2/3 of these meetings talking about policy, and I convinced no one. This isn't about policy. It isn't about economy. It isn't about any of these things. It is about the kind of country that we want to be. It is about the society that we want to live in. I'm sorry, before I start a speech, I'm just going I would just want to say, I would never, I mean, half of my family work in the steelworks in Port Talbot in South Wales. I would never have worked for the European Union if I thought it was harming their interests. This is the best endeavour in finding a different way of peoples of different countries to live together ever in human history. And that is the positive message that we have to say.
Wonderful. Mike.
Yeah, I think I'll stand up too, so I can see you all. I think I'll take a leaf out of your page there. Customs Union, People's Vote. Just to give you the big view on both of those. The Customs Union thing isn't just about saving the problems with the paperwork and with some of the ports. It's also important to take away some of the Brexiteer fantasy candy. The government is losing on this, first through the Lords and soon through the Parliament, through sensible people within the Conservative Party as well as the opposition parties. When you shut down that option, when you clip those wings because you say beyond here there is no pot of gold, that silly our Treasury has shown so, that is an important first step into getting rid of that fantasy that some people still have in their minds about coming out into all these free trade arguments. But also, it then sets up next step into talking about the single market and those interdependencies of regulations and VAT and how that impacts on the border as well. And this is kind of like a reverse entry into some of these issues. Because remember, after the referendum, Open Britain was like single market, single market. They were completely ignored. And it was hard Brexit all the way. They'd won by an inch but tried to take 100 miles. By starting with the Customs Union and flagging up all the issues through that, we've now got a route into other stuff. But that's technicalities. What we're doing with this People's Vote campaign is this is now a big beast of the pro-EU community that we have expanded and thrown our doors open in order to catch more people. During 2017, we had all these fragmented campaigns and everyone was saying you should come together. We were trying to come together but arguing about the messaging and what the political plan was going forward. We have grown together organically now by working together time and time again. Us at Scientists for EU and Healthier In, Open Britain, European movement, Best for Britain, in facts, our future, our choice, for our future's sake. The lot of us are coming together and we have got a beautiful community that we're growing here. And with the People's Vote, we're expanding that from just the Remain crowd to saying, hey, don't you think we should all have a say when we know more? And that is something that a lot of people buy into. So that's us opening up. Think of it like a three-gate process. First gate is, don't you think that people should have a say on whatever comes back? Don't you want to have a say? Don't you think that's a basic right? Yes. Next gate is, right, when something comes back, shouldn't we have the opportunity, if it's looking really, really crap, to just dump the whole thing altogether? And people say, well, yeah, okay, that would make sense. And then the third gate is, when this thing does come back, we go for it hell to leather because we know it's going to be incomparable to what we have now. But it's not just the negative thing of ripping it apart. It's like what was said from the audience before. It's like what Nick said. By that stage, it's about what kind of bright future do we want. I think by that stage, we will be sick of our own meanness over immigration. We've seen it with Windrush. We've seen it with the treatment here. There's a great line from that First World War poem, like a devil sick of sin. I think we're going to be sick of some of these attitudes that we had about immigration is going to be first, about slash and burn of all these regulations. We don't want, the British people do not want to go into a trade deal with Donald Trump and take in substandard milk that come from infected cows and they're infected others. We don't want chlorine-washed chickens because they have high bacterial load because they've been poorly kept. We don't want hormone-treated beef. And so what we're going to say is all of those promises, are we not sick of that meanness now? Are we not sick of being alone? What kind of future do we want? We've had a look at the landscape now. Britain deserves better than this. We are a team player, we are a team leader, and our youth deserve to come into a future where they are empowered in all of this framework. We've tested it, we've tried it, we've looked at the lot, and now it's up to us to drop this Brexit and to reopen a new and bright future for our youth as team players in this brilliant framework that we spent 40 years building up.
Thank you. Right, turning to my nominal right, Antony.
Standing up seems to be the thing, so I will. I've got, I think, two things that I would like to recommend to you to help move this forward. The first one is the next time there's a march in London, turn up and join the rest of us.
Yes.
23rd of June,
Put it in your
be
diary.
there, please. The second thing I'd like to say, and this is an appeal to Labour voters, the strategy of the Labour leadership at the moment seems to be based on the principle of not interrupting your enemy when he's making a mistake. This is a bogus policy, because if you're in the same boat and it's the other end of the boat that's leaking, it isn't much good waiting for the water to pour in, because you're all going to get wet. And so if you are a Labour voter and you want to appeal to your candidate, please explain to them that that is not a policy that can be pursued, and please ask them to put pressure on however they can through their party to get the Labour Party turned around, because with the best will in the world, unless we get the Labour Party on side here and behind us, I fear for the worst myself.
So naturally we would have moved the Labour candidate, but we'll start with Catherine and leave John the last word on this.
Not quite, there's John after me. Yes, I like setting a trend and getting everybody to stand up. So that was, I always like to be a trendsetter. I think that for me the most important is to get out the message that Brexit can and must be stopped. And I think those of the people that I've talked to who are not necessarily in Brexit circles, if you like, think, oh, well, we voted that, it's inevitable. You know, they come out with a mantra, the people's vote, and the rest of it. It is not so. It can and it must be stopped. It's a disaster for this country. So, we're in Oxford and we're a pretty well educated and pretty well committed audience here, but I have news for you that most people out there don't know, don't understand how the House of Commons works, don't know what their MPs are doing for them, and they don't know what Brexit is actually going to mean to them. And so I think we have a real job of education, and we can only do that if we're talking to people. Now, you're all members of clubs and societies, and whether it's the golf club or the bridge club or the Lions or whatever, just talk to people who are not of your mind and persuade them that it's because they know you, they like you, and they will understand that if you have a real story, you need to be talking to them. Don't be talking to your friends about Brexit and shaking your heads. Write to the local newspaper. Yes. But call up the local phone-ins on Radio Oxford and the other phone-ins. Speak with real stories. We've heard some tonight about how people are being affected. Use the real life examples. That's what gets to people, not, as you were saying, the policy is just over there and not there. Get on Twitter, tweet, use the hashtags, follow all of us, we're on Twitter. Do donate to organisations such as Oxford for Europe and the other ones and all the European movement, all of those. We need money to hold these sorts of events, to run the marches. Most of the marches you think sort of just happen. They take an enormous amount of organisation. Volunteer to help them. Do something, turn up when we have stalls in the streets so that you can talk to people and get them to sign their petitions. Sign up to the People's Vote. And I think this is really important, that we can, you know, you cannot delete a file on your computer and there's a little message pops up. Do you really want to delete this? Well, I mean, that's what we're talking about with the people's vote. We go back and we say, this is what they've negotiated for us. Is this really what you want? Now, a Brexiteer, it will say, oh, we've already had the vote and you know, you're going to make us vote until we get the right answer. It's not that. It's actually making sure, and if they're so sure that Brexit is a good idea, why are they worried about having a vote? You know, we have to have that people's vote. Do be careful of the language. Don't talk about a second referendum. Don't, because people will say, oh, well, we've already had that. This is a vote on the deal. It's the people's vote. The government is negotiating on your behalf. You deserve to have your say and endorse that or not, as the case may be. So lots of things to do, but don't be silent. Don't talk to your friends who are already with you on this. Talk to the people who are not. If you're sitting on the bus, talk to the next person on the bus to you. We're all in this together. I don't know what happened to this country after the 2012 Olympics. We were demonstrating, we were outward looking, we were welcoming, we were sure of ourselves. Somewhere between there and now, we've let the right wing take over this country. We have to fight back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. So, before I wrap up, last but not least, John.
I'll come over to you, Ruvi. Why not? Good evening, meine Damen und Herren, Monsieur et Madame, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers. I'm Councillor John Tanner, and first of all, I apologise for being late. I was at the Lord Mayor's annual dinner, and the soup was very good. But I much prefer to be here than eating my main course at the dinner, because this issue is so important. The first thing I want to do is to, as a Labour City Councillor, is to welcome you to Oxford Town Hall. I want to send greetings from Oxford Labour Party, because I believe we are on side. We're not moving fast enough in the right direction, but I think we are certainly on side, certainly in the Labour Party, whatever the leader may say. I mean, one shouldn't take too much notice of leaders, in my opinion. However, of any sort, what matters is the people. And you know, these Brexit negotiations, whatever happens nationally, I can assure you that Oxford City Council, of all parties, will make sure that Oxford remains an international, outward-looking city that is open to everyone. So we're not going to be put off our stride. We all know that this Brexit is going to be deeply damaging to the car factory, the universities and all the rest of you. You must have heard all of that. You must have heard all of that tonight. But I think there's one message I want. So two messages, first of all. The one is that a lot of you have been kind enough to admire the little badge or brooch I wear of the Union flag, the European Union flag with the British flag. Well, I've got some more, and I shall be at the door selling them at £2 each when you go out. So I want all of you to wear your badges and your brooches. Will you do that? Thank you very much. Right. It only cost you £2. And the point is this, I think, that we must not let our members of Parliament, whoever they are, off the hook. It seems to be quite clear that it is the responsibility of all our members of Parliament, whatever their party, to make sure that this country is prosperous, to make sure it's peaceful, and to make sure it's united. And they cannot allow a referendum that took place back in 2016 and was narrowly won to offload that responsibility. Their responsibility is for the future of this country, and they must ensure that that happens. So let's put all the pressure we can. I'm not a great one for mechanisms. I don't care whether it's a vote in Parliament, a general election, or the people's vote, you know, a second referendum of some sort. I don't mind, as long as we stay in the European Union. Thank you very much.
Right. Right, given that I believe in parliamentary and constitutional conventions, as is the tradition of this country, so I've decided to stand as well. Thanks very much, I think, on behalf of all of you, to all of our panellists. I think there's an extremely engaging, informative, I think honest discussions that we had, and I really want to thank Craig and Nick and Mike and Anthony and Catherine and John for joining us here. I want to thank all of you for coming, for sharing your experiences. It's very important. It's documented now because we've filmed it. We will make good use of this. Nobody, if this process ends up happening, nobody can say they haven't been warned about the implications. And as I think Mike has said, this is generational, and those who will let it go through will not be easily forgiven. What I want to ask you again, to reiterate the point that Catherine's made as well, to note this event wasn't cost-free, and this is a voluntary organization, and so assuming you found this to be a useful and informative event, please help us run more as you leave the audience, leave the auditorium. And yes, have a great chilly weekend. Bye.